In last week's episode, we talked about Westworld and what it means to find yourself. Let's see what you had to say. 3 Kinds of Salt on the subreddit talks about how it's hard to find yourself because it's a perspective problem, that yourself is a thing that you're within, and so it's hard to sort of see the whole of it from inside of it, and that a lot of the process is about finding that perspective and being able to get to a place, whatever that means, that allows you to kind of, behold what the self is. And I think that this is a great, and I think probably familiar way of stating one of the things that we're trying to get at in the episode, which is this idea of what it means for the self to be public versus private. It's like, we tend to think, I think, of the self as a thing that's locked away inside of us, or we are inside of it, and so we, it's like a room that you can't get out of. But if you could leave, it would be in some way out of you. It would be more public. And then the problem, of course, becomes how do you then show that to other people, and how do you share it or communicate it? And I think that that's something that we're going to talk a little bit about throughout the rest of this comment response. SchinzonOfRemus, also on the subreddit, shares 2 really interesting thoughts. The first being, how do you know that you have found yourself when you find it? And I think this is something that's very easy for the hosts of Westworld and very hard for the guests/humans, because the hosts, like we said, can point at it. They can literally locate the actual technology that represents what their self is, and Shinzon sort of takes this one step further and says that maybe this is a factor that makes the comparison between hosts and guests a little complicated, because being able to find and then move past the representation of their self, the host's development of consciousness actually represents an evolution in who or what they are as beings, whereas humans, normally when we talk about finding ourselves, the thing that we're talking about is, going on a really long hike to understand where our limits are and what our principles are, and that it's a very inward turning personal thing that doesn't represent a change in what it means to be human. And I think that's a really good point. And I think it's also something that I'm gonna be stuck on and I'm gonna be thinking a lot about, because I think that if you could reliably figure out what it means to have found yourself, which, right, I mean, are you ever gonna be able to do that? You would have insight into what human consciousness is in some way, and would that knowledge then be a part of a process that would then, I don't know, move people forward? And I think that that's some of what we talked about with regards to Arnold and Ford, that they don't talk a lot about what their aims are, but if they did aim to create consciousness, it's possible that was one of the things that they hoped would be an outcome. Fnoug writes a really great comment that has a lot of awesome thoughts in it, but I want to focus on something that's at the end, where they talk essentially about iteration and about how it might be that the hosts are able to go through this process of gaining consciousness because every time they are reset, every time they are hurt or destroyed or abused to a degree that they have to be repaired, sent to the butcher or whatever, whatever you want to call it, that they then get to re-experience who they are and the choices that they make, and that this is, they're also in these narrative loops, these things that they have to experience over and over and over again. I think that the sort of the side plot of the reveries and how those work is involved in this too, but that essentially they get to examine the choices that they are making and the experiences that they have in fine detail that the guests who lead, hold on, I'm gonna get this right, who lead limited, non-repeating, chaotic lives don't actually have the luxury of doing. And I think that this gets to something that Mary Einfeldt also talks about, which is, one of the things that maybe we're talking about when we talk about finding the self or finding yourself is knowing why it is that you make the choices that you make. And as a human being with a non-repeating chaotic life, it's rare that you get to make the same choices in the same situation and examine the context as closely as, say, a host might. And I think that this is a really, really interesting idea. So yeah, it's a great comment. And I didn't even quote any French people. I feel like this is some kind of accomplishment. Robert Williams assumes that the self is a constant thing and that it is through action that someone is able to sort of figure out or uncover what that is. And that one of the things that Westworld might do for guests is allow them to take actions that are not normally permitted without consequence. And the phrasing that he uses is that actions without consequence, even for the wealthy, are rare. And I think this is really interesting because I think we depart a little bit on this perspective. That for me, Westworld was very much a place where rich people who are used to getting away with things can go to get away with even worse things that they wish they could do but couldn't because there are laws and people would actually get hurt. But I think that this is this is sort of maybe at the kernel of trying to figure out, like we were talking about Ford, trying to figure out who it is that is at Westworld and what they need, and what Westworld does or does not provide for them. Grilsha makes the really interesting point that it is possible to argue that only the hosts can be authentic because since their personalities and their stories are to a certain degree hardwired, hard-coded, until they emerge out of them, that they are capable of being authentic in a way that guests who are capable of amazing amounts of self-deception would never be. And that is something that contributes to the fact that the hosts may be able to find themselves in a way that guests are not, because guests are just, perhaps as people, incapable of allowing themselves that kind of, I think, availability, which is one of the things that we talked about. But yeah, I think this is a great way to render this idea. Negative, I am a meat popsicle.